Welcome to the Esoerotic Dark Feminine Magic podcast. My name is Crimson, creatrix of Esoeroticism, and I help mystically minded folks awaken their dark feminine magic. Welcome to the portal of enchantment. Welcome to the Esoerotic Dark Feminine Magic podcast. And this is episode 2. If you missed it, episode 1 is all about demystifying our namesake, Esoeroticism. So, what it is, why we'd be interested in it. So, if you missed it, go back and check that out. But then this episode 2 is about the second part of our namesake, namely dark feminine magic. And more specifically, in this episode, we're going to talk to what is the dark feminine. And it's 2025. I probably don't even need to say this, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the feminine, the dark feminine, is accessible and prevalent in all gender identifications. So it doesn't matter how you identify. And in fact, you'll never hear me talk specifically just to women when it comes to this work, because I know and I'm interested in connecting with people of all gender identifications, because this work is applicable to anyone who is interested. And so with that being said, what is the dark feminine? First, I think we should establish, how is the feminine different from the masculine? Because the dark feminine is just not the masculine version of the feminine. So I have a little chart here I'm going to read through to differentiate between feminine energy and masculine energy. So the feminine is feeling versus thinking. It's intuition versus logic. The subconscious versus the conscious. Creativity versus controlled structure. Nonlinear versus linear. Collaboration versus competition, experiencing versus achieving, receiving versus giving, pleasure versus survival, and ebb and flow versus consistency. And so hopefully that's a good jumping off point to understand what feminine energy is. So now let's take it a step further and differentiate between what is the light feminine versus the dark feminine. So quite simply, you can consider the light feminine to be qualities of the feminine that are embraced and celebrated in society, whereas the dark feminine are qualities of the feminine that have been stigmatized and therefore repressed. So the light feminine is not the good feminine, and the dark feminine is not the bad feminine. So don't think about them in terms of one is exalted over the other. So they're both completely valid forms of feminine expression, and we'll talk about it in a moment of perhaps why one is stigmatized versus the other. So, but let's start giving some examples of what would qualify as the light feminine. I always like to think of the light feminine as this more youthful, maiden-like energy. So again, I'm just going to read off some lists here to add more clarity to this topic. So, examples of the light feminine: external beauty, sensual purity, love and light, grace and patience. It's soft and delicate, it's nurturing and cooperative, it's peace and play. And like I said, you can kind of start to associate that with a more youthful, innocent maiden energy. And I want to be really clear. All of this energy is completely valid, and I would even say necessary to embody in some ways to holistically express our full breadth of feminine energy. Now, that being said, let's talk about what is this stigmatized dark feminine. This would be things like subconscious shadow work, sovereign sexuality, magic and witchcraft, what I like to call sacred or necessary destruction. It's empowered boundaries. It's prioritizing authentic desires, pleasure, and passion. And as opposed to the more innocent maiden, I like to think of it as the unapologetic crone. So again, one is not better than the other, but I'm willing to bet that that second list are aspects of yourself that maybe not all of them, but some of them you hold some form of resistance to, whether that be simply because you don't see value in them, or potentially there's more fear, shame, judgment. Of course, the Esoeroticism addresses the sovereign sexuality aspect of the dark feminine, but this is why in Esoeroticism, I like to add and dark feminine magic, because these other qualities of doing subconscious work, of prioritizing pleasure, of being unapologetic, being boundaried, respecting cycles of death and rebirth, these to me are all inherently tied to the work that we do when it comes to an esoerotic practice. And so we do not want to think of the dark feminine as quote unquote bad or evil or nefarious. There is a number of reasons for this. First and foremost is I have a whole issue with the idea of darkness and black being associated with evil or being nefarious in general. So a lot of times you hear this, oh, it's black magic, it's the black arts, and it's meant to suggest that, ooh, this is baneful, this is nefarious, this is meant to hurt someone. And I'm trying to always advocate when it comes to magic that if that's what you're trying to say, use those words, because black magic is not inherently nefarious or baneful. Black magic is simply using these qualities we just talked about, this ability to go subconscious, and also our ability to release, to let go, to repel, versus white magic, which is to attract and to call in. And so if you've ever burned a piece of paper of things that are no longer serving you that you want to release during a full moon, you've done black magic. And you can also consider the new moon to really be a portal of dark magic or black magic, because it is that absence of light that creates that womb of rebirth and new creation. So yeah, it's also a disservice to our melanated brothers and sisters and fellow humans to always associate darkness and blackness with bad. And so just always trying to be aware of our words. But I have seen so often when you look up the dark feminine online, it'll be suggesting that it is some kind of version of the feminine that is manipulative, that is conniving, or that is like simply unhinged. And something I also want to touch on is that the dark feminine is not the wounded feminine. So the dark feminine doesn't manipulate others with their sexuality, nor are they self-destructive or destructive to others based on their lack of ability to manage their emotions or their energy. I see that a lot, like this unhinged, wild, feral, like I love me some feral energy, some primal expression, but there's a point where it's so wounded that it hurts oneself or the other, versus just as a form of like natural connection. Does that make sense? I mean, you see it a lot in like dating world videos where it's like, put on your dark feminine, seduce the man and get what you want and take all of his money and blah, 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 like barf. We're more conscious than that. And I'd like to think that the dark feminine is really in its most exalted form sacred. I mean, think of those things that we mentioned, like being able to go into the depths of self, to really reach into our shadow and understand ourselves, our old stories, our patterns, our emotions that had never been processed through the shadow work. That is very sacred. Our magic and our witchcraft, or our connection to the spirit world or the energetic world or the natural world, however you want to approach that, that's sacred. Our ability to know ourselves, to have sacred standards is essentially what's happening when we set empowered boundaries. We're setting sacred standards for ourselves. And even this ability to really sit with death, to let go, to embrace endings, that's really hard in a masculine society because it's linear. Remember, we said the masculine is linear, so it always wants to have like a straight trajectory, where the feminine is like, there's a point where you shouldn't be pushing through, and there's a point where things have come to its natural ending. That is the cycle. We see it in the moon cycles, the seasonal cycles, and we see it in the cycle of life. So all of these aspects of the dark feminine can be expressed in very exalted, empowered, and sacred ways. But because they've been so repressed and relegated to the darkness, deemed taboo, have had a lot of shame and judgment and fear around by controlling systems, a lot of us have truly been led to believe that the dark feminine is scary, or that these are aspects of ourselves that we should completely avoid. They're not quote unquote holy. And so I just want to take a moment to talk about potentially why the dark feminine has been repressed and relegated to the darkness. So let's just talk about a few examples of how the dark feminine, when repressed, can actually serve others. So, for example, expressing our sexuality and reclaiming our sexuality as our own allows us to have great life force and creative magnetism, and that doesn't make for a very docile and obedient workforce. Honoring our authentic desires and following our passion doesn't really allow us to be selflessly caring for others and serving others. And what we were talking about with those boundaries, if we don't feel empowered to set boundaries, that allows us to set the bar pretty low when it comes to personal standards and what we'll accept as being okay in our life. If through systems like magic or witchcraft, you recognize that you have a personal connection to divinity, then you're no longer going to listen to and follow the controlling rules of specific dogmatic systems. I'll leave that at that. And if you have a fear around endings, or as we're calling them, sacred necessary destruction and rebirth, then you're not going to feel empowered to go in and resurrect new systems that are potentially more equitable and serve the greater good. Do you see how through all of these examples, by being fearful of these dark feminine qualities, we're being forced to stay into a very controlled and disassociated box? And so I don't want us to think about it's the dark feminine versus the light feminine. They really do work together. The dark feminine should feed into the light feminine, and the light feminine into the dark feminine. And I always like to say, without the dark feminine, the light feminine can be very easily manipulated. And so let's use the example we said with the light feminine being very nurturing and cooperative. Well, that's an awesome thing, and we all want to be able to possess those qualities. It's important that we care for the world around us. However, without what we talked about with the dark feminine, those sacred boundaries, those standards, well, we can be pushed to a point where we completely neglect ourselves and disassociate it and release following our personal and authentic desires and passions. It's like that selfless mothering archetype. And at the same time, if we're always lingering in the darkness, if we're always just unearthing our subconscious self and our shadow self, well, we never return to our conscious reality. And as a reminder, life needs to also be expressed, and we need that play, and we need that joy, and we need to integrate those shadow reflections. Otherwise, they just remain stagnant. So again, The light and the darkness intertwined. So why am I all about the dark feminine? Well, because I wanted to stigmatize these aspects of ourselves so that we can live more fully in our feminine. It's also why I am a fierce advocate of the feminine in general, because I feel like I've mastered my masculine parts. I feel like to survive in this world, we've all had to. That's not where we need to more deeply develop ourselves. We need to give more attention and priority and devotion to our feminine selves and our dark feminine selves, if we truly want to, I mean, this sounds grandiose, but if we truly want to change the world, if we want to create a society that is more compassionate and just and serves the greater good. There is so much transformational power and potential, and of course pleasure, that lies within the dark feminine. And hopefully through this podcast, you've been able to release potentially some associations you once held to it, because I don't want you to think that you have to wear a latex suit and red lipstick and high heels and fishnets and be fucking angry and manipulative to embody the dark feminine. That's not it at all. We all have the capacity to embody the dark feminine. And in fact, in doing so in your own unique way is how you're going to inspire others to do the same. And we're going to topple this system that has for too long benefited from us just remaining docile and obedient. So just to wrap it up, I want to talk about how the dark feminine magic weaves into our esoerotic practice. So this is why we do things like journal prompts and shadow reflections. This is why we do things like divination, so we can get depth of insight beyond our conscious self, not as a way for some predictive future telling, but really as a way to get to understand ourselves at a deeper level while bypassing like our conscious blockages. This is why we use magic in esoeroticism in general. To me, magic is simply moving beyond the mundane using unseen forces. In my practice, that is energy. If some practices, it can also be spirits, it can be nature elementals. I'm down with all of those too, but in esoeroticism, we really think about it as the unseen energetic forces to move beyond the mundane. I mean, truly, an esoerotic ritual is a magic spell. This is why we always prioritize embodied pleasure in our expression and in our movement. And this will be a future episode, but I always like to say pleasure is a portal. It's a portal of non-resistance so that we can both release and receive with ease. And so getting our bodies in pleasure is actually quite a radical act, especially against systems that have benefited for so long for us being numb and disassociated. But there will be future episodes on that. But the last thing I want to speak about when it comes to the embodiment is truly reconnecting with our bodies as a way not just to manage our nervous system, which is obviously so important, nervous system regulation, but also to reclaim a sense of safety in our own bodies. That is essential if we want to show up in our righteous rage, if we are going to lead into sacred destruction and rebirth, if we are going to hold our sacred boundaries. We need to, first and foremost, feel safe and regulated in our bodies to do so. And without an embodiment practice, that is going to be really difficult. So I think that's an aspect of embodiment, and especially in this dark feminine way where we move through shame and fear and guilt around our sexuality, and we learn to feel safe in its expression, that is going to roll over into how we're able to then show up in external aspects of our lives. And I didn't mention the righteous rage before, but to me, that is just such a natural part of being fully emotionally expressed in the feminine. It's just that the light feminine, again, may repress it because that's not something that is deemed quote unquote acceptable to show rage. Whereas the dark feminine, well, let's say the wounded feminine would let that rage detrimentally hurt themselves or others, not express in a healthy way. But the dark feminine would understand how to express and to move through rage in an empowered manner that actually helps alchemize that rage into rebirth and recreation. So, ooh, that was a lot. So, with all of that being said, I'm going to end the episode here. These first two episodes, I'm going to be guiding everyone to these just to understand the basis of the work that I do and that we do in all of our esoerotic offerings, because there is so much deeper of a why. And I think when you do understand that, when you then move into embodying it, you have that greater fire and devotion to really understanding of how this work is divinely transformational. So I'm looking forward to future episodes where we have more deeper and nuanced conversations. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Stay in your magic. Mwah. And I'll see you again soon. Bye. Thank you for joining. Follow me on Instagram at crimson.minx and visit esoerotic.com to learn to live more fully and unapologetically in your magnetic power, sensual pleasure, and unlimited creative potential.